when my own family dragged me into court, claiming I was a failure who didn't deserve a single penny of my late grandfather's estate. I thought my life had hit rock bottom. But as the judge was about to rule against me, the courtroom doors swung open and 12 Marines in full dress uniform marched in behind me. What happened next changed everything. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Rebecca Martinez, and this story begins 3 years ago when I was 28 years old, living in a cramped studio apartment in downtown Phoenix, Arizona. While my siblings lived in their suburban mansions with white picket fences and perfectly manicured lawns, I was scraping together rent money from my job at a local veterinary clinic. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was the only one in my family who had actually served our country, yet I was also the only one struggling to make ends meet. Growing up as the youngest of 4 children in the Martinez household meant I was always fighting for attention, always trying to prove myself worthy of the family name. My father, Roberto Martinez, owned a successful construction company that had been passed down through 3 generations. My older brothers, Carlos and Diego, had seamlessly stepped into management roles straight out of college, while my sister Elena had married into money and spent her days organizing charity galas for the Phoenix elite. Then there was me, the black sheep who had shocked everyone by enlisting in the Marines right after high school instead of following the predetermined path to business school. The disappointment in my father's eyes when I announced my decision still haunts me. "Mujeres don't belong in the military, Rebecca," he had said, shaking his head. "You're throwing away your future for what? To play soldier?" But my grandfather, Alejandro Martinez, abuelo to all of us, had been different. While the rest of the family saw my military service as a rebellious phase, abuelo understood. He had immigrated to the United States from Mexico in 1952, with nothing but the clothes on his back and an unwavering belief in the American dream. He built the family construction business from the ground up, working 18-hour days until his hands were permanently stained with concrete dust and his back was bent from decades of manual labor. Abuelo never said much, but his weathered hands would squeeze my shoulder every time I came home on leave, and his eyes would shine with a pride that spoke louder than words. He was the only one who attended my graduation from Marine Corps boot camp at Parris Island. While my parents made excuses about work obligations and my siblings claimed they couldn't get time off, abuelo drove 15 hours straight from Phoenix to South Carolina to watch me receive my Eagle, Globe, and Anchor. During my 4 years of active duty, which included 2 deployments to Afghanistan, abuelo was my lifeline to home. His letters arrived like clockwork every Tuesday, filled with updates about the family business, neighborhood gossip, and gentle reminders that he was proud of the woman I had become. He never mentioned the growing distance between me and the rest of the family, but I could read between the lines. When I returned from my final deployment in 2019, the family dynamics had shifted dramatically. My brothers had expanded the business into commercial real estate development, and the Martinez Construction Company was now worth millions. Elena's husband had been elected to the Phoenix City Council, elevating the family's social status even further. I felt like a stranger at family gatherings, listening to conversations about stock portfolios and country club memberships, while I struggled with the transition back to civilian life. The nightmares had started during my second deployment. Improvised explosive devices, or IEDs, had become the enemy's weapon of choice, and our convoy had been hit twice in a 3-month period. I lost 2 members of my unit, Sarah Chen and Marcus Williams, in an attack outside Kandahar. The guilt of surviving when they didn't eat away at me like acid, and sleep became my enemy. The Department of Veterans Affairs prescribed medication for what they clinically termed post-traumatic stress disorder, but pills couldn't erase the images burned into my memory or silence the voices of my fallen comrades that echoed in my dreams. My family's reaction to my struggles was a mixture of uncomfortable silence and barely concealed embarrassment. When I had a panic attack during Elena's elaborate birthday party, triggered by the sound of firecrackers that reminded me too much of gunfire, my mother simply told guests I was overtired from work. The incident became family folklore, whispered about in hushed tones, as evidence of my instability. Abuelo was the only one who understood. He would invite me over for coffee on Sunday mornings, and we would sit in comfortable silence on his back porch, watching the desert sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Sometimes he would share stories from his own youth, tales of poverty and discrimination that he had overcome through sheer determination. Other times, he would simply listen as I tried to put my experiences into words that civilian minds could comprehend. La Familia is supposed to be your foundation, Mina, he told me one particularly difficult morning when I had shown up at his door at 5 a.m., unable to sleep. But sometimes, the people who share your blood forget that strength comes in many forms. You carry the strength of warriors, Rebecca. Never let them make you believe that is a weakness. Those Sunday morning conversations became my sanctuary, the only place where I felt truly understood. Abuelo never tried to fix me or offer empty platitudes about time healing all wounds. He simply accepted me as I was, scars, nightmares, and all. When Abuelo suffered a massive heart attack in December 2021, I was the one who found him. I had stopped by to check on him after he missed our Sunday coffee for the first time in 2 years. The paramedics said he had been gone for hours, but his face looked peaceful, almost relieved. In his final moments, he was clutching a letter he had been writing, a letter addressed to me. The funeral was an elaborate affair that reflected the family's newfound wealth and status, rather than Abuelo's humble nature. Hundreds of people attended, including politicians, business leaders, and society figures who had never exchanged more than pleasantries with my grandfather. My siblings gave eloquent eulogies about his legacy and contributions to the community, but their words felt hollow, rehearsed speeches that captured none of the man's true essence. I spoke last, sharing memories of our Sunday morning conversations and the wisdom he had shared during my darkest moments. As I stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces, I realized that most of these people had never really known Alejandro Martinez, the immigrant who had worked with his hands, the grandfather who had driven 15 hours to watch his granddaughter graduate from boot camp, the man who understood that strength came in many forms. The reading of the will took place a week later in the mahogany-paneled office of Harrison, Blackwood & Associates, the prestigious law firm that had handled the family's legal affairs for decades. My father's siblings and I gathered around the massive conference table, while attorney Gerald Blackwood shuffled through documents with the solemnity of a funeral director. The initial bequests were predictable. My grandmother, who had passed away 5 years earlier, had left her jewelry and personal effects to Elena. Various charitable organizations received modest donations. The family business and the bulk of the estate, worth an estimated $12 million, was to be divided equally among his 4 grandchildren. But then came the surprise that would tear our family apart forever. To my granddaughter, Rebecca Martinez, Mr. Blackwood read in his measured baritone voice, "Who has shown courage in the face of adversity and has served her country with honor, I leave the entirety of my personal residence at 847 Desert Rose Lane, including all contents and the surrounding 5-acre property. Additionally, I bequeath to Rebecca my collection of vintage automobiles, housed in the property's garage, and the sum of $2 million from my personal savings account, separate from the business holdings." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the air conditioning humming and the distant sound of traffic on Central Avenue, but nobody in that room seemed to be breathing. Elena was the first to speak, her voice rising to a pitch that made the crystal water glasses on the table vibrate. "There has to be some mistake," she said, her perfectly manicured fingernails drumming against the table surface. "Daddy, this can't be right. Rebecca has been unstable. She's not capable of managing that kind of responsibility." Carlos leaned forward, his face flushed with indignation. "This is ridiculous. She's been living paycheck to paycheck while we've been building the family business. What has she ever contributed to this family besides embarrassment?" My father remained silent, but his jaw was clenched so tightly that I could see the muscles twitching beneath his skin. Diego, usually the diplomat among my siblings, tried to maintain a veneer of calm, but his hands were shaking as he reached for his coffee cup. Mr. Blackwood cleared his throat diplomatically. "The will is quite clear and legally binding. Mr. Martinez was of sound mind when these documents were prepared 18 months ago. He specifically requested that I include a personal letter to be read only to Rebecca. The letter, written in Abuelo's careful handwriting, explained everything. He had watched my siblings grow increasingly focused on material wealth and social status, while I had remained true to the values he had tried to instill in all of us. The house had been his sanctuary, the place where he had built his American dream one brick at a time. He wanted it to remain with someone who understood its true value. "You are the keeper of our family's real legacy, Mija," the letter concluded. "Not the money or the business, but the strength and integrity that brought us to this country. Use what I'm giving you to build the life you deserve, and remember that I am proud of the woman you have become." That letter should have been the end of it, but it was actually just the beginning of a battle that would consume the next 18 months of my life and reveal the true character of the people I had called family. The inheritance dispute officially began 3 weeks after the will reading when I received a registered letter from a different law firm, Morrison, Webb & Partners. The letter, signed by attorney Jonathan Morrison himself, informed me that my family was contesting the will on grounds of undue influence and questionable mental capacity of the deceased. I stared at the legal document in my tiny kitchen, the words blurring together as rage and disbelief washed over me in equal measure. They were claiming that I had somehow manipulated Abuelo into changing his will, taking advantage of an elderly man's deteriorating mental state. The accusations were so outrageous, so far from the truth, that I actually laughed out loud, a bitter, hollow sound that echoed off the bare walls of my apartment. But the laughter died quickly when I realized the implications. A probate court battle could drag on for years, and I didn't have the financial resources to fight the Morrison firm, known throughout Arizona for their ruthless corporate litigation tactics. My family, on the other hand, had deep pockets and powerful connections throughout Phoenix's legal and political establishment. The next few months became a nightmare of depositions, court filings, and character assassination attempts. Morrison's team painted me as an unstable veteran who had preyed upon my grandfather's loneliness and declining health. They brought in witnesses, neighbors, family friends, even some of my own extended relatives, who testified about my erratic behavior and concerning mental state. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Mrs. Patricia Henley, who lived next door to Abuelo's house, took the stand and described how she had seen me screaming and crying in his backyard during one of my visits. She conveniently omitted the context that I had been having a flashback triggered by a helicopter flying overhead, and Abuelo had calmly guided me through breathing exercises until the panic subsided. Dr. Raymond Kellerman, a psychiatrist who had never actually treated me, testified as an expert witness about the potential effects of PTSD on judgment and decision-making. He suggested that my condition might have made me manipulative and desperate, characteristics that could lead someone to exploit a vulnerable elderly person. The most devastating testimony came from my own brother Carlos, who described a family dinner where I had allegedly threatened to make Abuelo pay for the family's lack of support. In reality, I had simply expressed frustration about feeling excluded from family decisions, but Carlos twisted my words into something sinister and calculating. My court-appointed attorney, David Reeves, was a well-meaning public defender who specialized in criminal cases, not estate law. He did his best with limited resources, but he was clearly outmatched by Morrison's team of specialists. During cross-examinations, he struggled to challenge their witnesses effectively, and his objections were frequently overruled by Judge Margaret Thompson, a stern woman in her 60s who seemed unimpressed by my military service record. The proceedings took place in the Maricopa County Superior Court, an imposing building with marble columns and polished floors that echoed with every footstep. Each court date felt like walking into an ambush, facing a room full of people who had already decided I was guilty of manipulating a dying old man. Elena attended every hearing, dressed in expensive designer suits and flanked by her influential husband, Councilman Richard Pemberton. She would sit in the front row with an expression of wounded dignity, occasionally dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief whenever the attorneys described how I had torn the family apart with my greed. The media attention made everything worse. The Phoenix Business Journal ran a story titled, "Construction Dynasty Torn Apart by Military Daughter's Inheritance Grab," complete with a photo of me in my dress uniform, alongside a picture of the contested mansion. Local television news crews camped outside the courthouse, shoving microphones in my face and asking loaded questions about whether I felt guilty for destroying family unity. My job at the veterinary clinic became untenable when clients started recognizing me from the news coverage. Dr. Susan Walsh, the clinic owner, called me into her office 6 months into the legal battle and explained that several longtime clients had expressed discomfort about having their pets treated by someone involved in such a sordid family dispute. "I'm truly sorry, Rebecca," Dr. Walsh said, avoiding eye contact as she handed me my final paycheck. "You're an excellent veterinary technician, but I have to think about what's best for the business. Unemployment benefits barely covered my rent, and the stress of the ongoing court case was taking a severe toll on my mental health. The nightmares from my military service intensified, now mixed with anxiety dreams about losing in court and being branded a family pariah for the rest of my life. I stopped eating regularly and lost nearly 20 pounds, my already lean frame becoming gaunt and hollow-eyed. The turning point came during a particularly brutal deposition where Morrison himself grilled me for 6 hours straight. He questioned every aspect of my relationship with Abuelo, demanding detailed explanations for every conversation, every visit, every moment we had shared. He made me recount traumatic experiences from my military deployment, then suggested that these experiences had made me emotionally unstable and prone to manipulation tactics learned in combat situations. "Isn't it true, Miss Martinez?" Morrison said, leaning across the conference table with predatory intensity, "that your grandfather felt sorry for you because of your inability to function in civilian society? And isn't it true that you exploited that sympathy to convince him to change his will?" I wanted to scream, to flip the table and storm out, but I forced myself to remain calm. "That's absolutely false," I replied through gritted teeth. "My grandfather respected my service to this country, and he understood my struggles better than anyone else in my family." Morrison smiled coldly. "Your struggles, yes. Let's talk about those struggles. You've been treated for PTSD, correct? You've had violent outbursts in public. You've been unable to maintain steady employment or stable relationships?" David objected weakly to the line of questioning, but the damage was being done. Morrison was systematically destroying my credibility, painting me as a damaged veteran who couldn't be trusted to tell the truth about my own motivations. The worst part was seeing my family's reaction to these character attacks. They sat stone-faced as Morrison tore apart my military service, my mental health, and my relationship with Abuelo. Not once did any of them object to the vicious portrayal being painted of their own sister and daughter. After that deposition, I seriously considered dropping the case entirely. The inheritance wasn't worth destroying what little remained of my relationship with my family, and the constant stress was pushing me toward a complete breakdown. I drafted a letter to David Reeves, instructing him to withdraw our contest of the will challenge. But that night, I found myself standing in Abuelo's house, the house that was technically still mine until the court ruled otherwise. I had been staying there occasionally when my apartment felt too suffocating, and the familiar surroundings usually brought me comfort. I walked through the rooms where we had shared so many conversations, touched the furniture he had built with his own hands, and tried to imagine what he would say about the current situation. In his bedroom, I discovered something that changed everything. A wooden box hidden beneath loose floorboards under his bed. Inside were letters, dozens of them, that Abuelo had written but never sent. Letters to my father, expressing disappointment about how the family had treated me. Letters to my siblings, urging them to recognize my worth beyond their narrow definition of success. And letters to me, documenting his growing concern about the family's values and his determination to ensure that his legacy went to someone who truly understood its meaning. One letter, dated just 2 months before his death, contained a passage that made me cry for the first time since the legal battle began. "Rebecca represents everything. I hoped this family would become brave, selfless, committed to something greater than personal gain. She has faced dangers that would terrify her brothers, shown courage that would humble her sister, and maintained her integrity, despite being treated as an outsider by the people who should love her most. The house, the money, the cars, these are just objects. But Rebecca carries our family's true inheritance, the values that brought us to America and made us strong." Armed with these letters, I marched into David's office the next morning and told him we were fighting this case to the bitter end. The letters provided crucial evidence of Abuelo's mental clarity and his deliberate decision-making process regarding the inheritance. They also revealed a pattern of family dysfunction that extended far beyond simple sibling rivalry. Morrison's team tried to have the letters excluded as evidence, arguing that they were, quote, self-serving documents, that couldn't be properly authenticated. But handwriting experts confirmed their authenticity, and the content corroborated testimony from several of Abuelo's friends who had witnessed his growing disappointment with his family's treatment of me. The discovery of the letters shifted the narrative of the case. But my family's legal team wasn't finished with their attacks. They brought in additional witnesses to testify about my instability, including a former coworker who claimed I had been aggressive and unpredictable during my brief employment at a Phoenix insurance company. What this witness failed to mention was that the insurance company had a toxic work environment where veterans were routinely discriminated against. I had filed a complaint with Human Resources about a supervisor who had made derogatory comments about broken soldiers and had been retaliated against until I finally quit. As the trial date approached, the stress reached unbearable levels. I was surviving on a combination of unemployment benefits and occasional odd jobs, barely scraping together enough money to keep my apartment and buy groceries. The legal fees were mounting despite David's reduced rate for indigent clients, and I had already sold my car and most of my possessions to stay afloat. My former Marine unit brothers, scattered across the country, tried to offer support through phone calls and care packages, but they were dealing with their own transitions to civilian life and couldn't provide much concrete help. I felt more isolated than I had ever felt, even during the darkest moments of my deployment. The breaking point came 3 weeks before the trial was scheduled to begin. I received an eviction notice from my landlord, who had apparently been contacted by someone claiming that I was involved in illegal activities and posed a threat to other tenants. I suspected my family's influence, but couldn't prove it. Standing in my empty apartment with a cardboard box containing my few remaining possessions, I realized that my family had succeeded in their real goal. They hadn't just challenged the inheritance. They had systematically destroyed my life, my reputation, and my ability to function in Phoenix society. That night, sleeping in Abuelo's house with my belongings scattered around the living room, I made a decision that would determine the outcome of everything. I was going to fight back, not just in court, but by exposing the truth about who my family really was and what they had done to destroy an old man's final wishes. The trial was set to begin on March 15th, and I had exactly 3 weeks to prepare for the most important battle of my life. The morning of March 15th arrived gray and overcast, with storm clouds gathering over downtown Phoenix like an ominous warning. I stood outside the Maricopa County Superior Court at 7 a.m., 2 hours before proceedings were scheduled to begin, wearing the only professional outfit I still owned, a black pantsuit I had bought for job interviews that never led to employment. My hands trembled as I clutched a worn leather briefcase containing Abuelo's letters and what remained of my legal documents. David Reeves arrived 30 minutes later, looking harried and underprepared, his cheap suit wrinkled and his hair disheveled from what I assumed was another sleepless night reviewing case files. "Rebecca, I need to be honest with you," he said, avoiding eye contact as we climbed the courthouse steps. "Morrison's team filed additional motions yesterday. They're bringing in 3 more character witnesses, and they've somehow obtained your complete military medical records." My stomach dropped. Those records contained intimate details about my PTSD diagnosis, therapy sessions, and medication history. Information that was supposed to be confidential, but had somehow made its way into the opposing counsel's hands. The violation felt like being stripped naked in public, every private moment of vulnerability exposed for legal exploitation. Judge Thompson's courtroom was packed beyond capacity. My family occupied the entire front section on the left side, surrounded by their expensive legal team and various supporters from Phoenix's business community. Elena sat directly behind the plaintiff's table, her presence commanding attention in a navy blue Chanel suit that probably cost more than I had earned in the past 6 months. I recognized faces from the Phoenix Country Club, prominent real estate developers, and even a few city council members who had come to show solidarity with the Martinez family, the successful, respectable Martinez family that was being threatened by their unstable military daughter. On my side of the courtroom, the benches were largely empty except for Mrs. Rosa Delgado, an elderly neighbor of Abuelo's who had insisted on attending despite her arthritis, and surprisingly, Dr. Susan Walsh from the veterinary clinic. Dr. Walsh had apparently felt guilty about firing me and wanted to show support, though she sat in the back row as if ready to flee at the first sign of controversy. Morrison stood to deliver his opening statement with the confidence of a man who had never lost a high-profile case. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his custom-tailored suit projected authority, and his voice carried the resonance of someone accustomed to commanding courtrooms. "Your Honor, this case represents a tragic example of elder abuse disguised as family loyalty," he began, gesturing toward my family with theatrical sympathy. Alejandro Martinez was a successful businessman who built an empire through hard work and determination. But in his final years, he became vulnerable to manipulation from a granddaughter whose military service had left her psychologically damaged and financially desperate. He outlined their case methodically, describing how I had allegedly isolated Abuelo from other family members, convinced him that his successful sons and accomplished daughter didn't deserve his legacy, and exploited his sympathy for my mental health struggles to secure a massive inheritance. The evidence will show that Rebecca Martinez systematically alienated Mr. Martinez from his other grandchildren through a calculated campaign of emotional manipulation, Morrison continued. She presented herself as the family victim while simultaneously plotting to steal what rightfully belonged to the people who had actually contributed to the family business. David's opening statement was significantly shorter and less polished. He stressed Abuelo's mental competency at the time the will was written, and emphasized that the inheritance reflected his genuine desire to reward my military service and values-based approach to life. Alejandro Martinez made a conscious, deliberate decision about how to distribute his personal assets, David argued. His choice may surprise some family members, but surprise doesn't constitute grounds for overturning a legally valid will. The prosecution called their witnesses in rapid succession, each one adding another layer to their portrait of me as an unstable manipulator. Mrs. Henley repeated her distorted account of my panic attack, this time adding embellishments about how I had threatened Abuelo when he tried to calm me down. Dr. Kellerman returned to expand on his theories about PTSD-induced manipulation tactics, citing studies about how combat veterans sometimes developed sociopathic tendencies as coping mechanisms. He had clearly been coached to make his testimony as damaging as possible while maintaining a veneer of scientific objectivity. The most devastating moment came when Carlos took the witness stand. My eldest brother, dressed in an expensive charcoal suit and speaking with practiced sincerity, described a family dinner where I had allegedly outlined my plan to, quote, make sure Abuelo remembered who really deserved his money. Rebecca was angry that the rest of us had successful careers while she was struggling, Carlos testified, his voice heavy with manufactured sadness. She said that Abuelo owed her something because she was the only one who had sacrificed for the country. She made it clear that she intended to collect on that debt. The conversation Carlos described had never happened, at least not in the way he presented it. There had been a family dinner where I expressed frustration about feeling excluded, but my actual words had been about wanting emotional support, not financial compensation. Carlos had taken fragments of truth and reconstructed them into a narrative that served their legal strategy. Elena's testimony focused on my alleged mental instability, describing incidents where I had displayed concerning behavior at family gatherings. She painted a picture of someone whose PTSD made her unpredictable and potentially dangerous, someone who might have frightened an elderly man into changing his will. I love my sister, Elena said, dabbing at her eyes with perfect timing. But she came back from the war changed. We tried to help her, but she became increasingly resentful of our success. She spent hours with Abuelo, filling his head with stories about how we didn't appreciate her sacrifice. Even my father testified against me, though his testimony was brief and focused primarily on my decision to join the military against family wishes. He described my choice as evidence of poor judgment and an inability to commit to family responsibilities. Rebecca always went her own way, he said, his accent thicker than usual under the stress of testifying. She never understood what it meant to build something lasting, to work within the family structure. The military gave her an excuse to avoid real responsibility. Morrison's case was thorough, methodical, and devastating. By the time they rested, I felt like I had been systematically dismantled in front of a room full of strangers. Every aspect of my character, my service record, and my relationship with Abuelo had been twisted into evidence of manipulation and greed. David called me to testify in my own defense, and I spent 3 hours on the witness stand trying to reconstruct the truth from the wreckage of my family's accusations. I described the real conversations with Abuelo, the genuine bond we had shared, and the values-based discussions that had led to his decision about the inheritance. But Morrison's cross-examination was brutal. He forced me to detail my PTSD symptoms, my employment struggles, and my financial desperation in excruciating detail. He made me recount the specifics of my panic attacks, my therapy sessions, and my medication regimen, turning my mental health treatment into evidence of instability. "Isn't it true, Miss Martinez, that you've been prescribed antipsychotic medication?" he asked, knowing full well that the medication was a standard PTSD treatment with an unfortunate name. "It's not antipsychotic medication," I replied. "It's a standard treatment for combat-related PTSD that helps with sleep disturbances and anxiety." "But the medication does affect your perception of reality, doesn't it?" Morrison pressed. "It alters your brain chemistry in ways that could impact your judgment and decision-making?" No matter how I answered, Morrison twisted my responses to support his narrative. If I defended my mental health treatment, I was admitting to psychological problems. If I downplayed my symptoms, I was being dishonest about the severity of my condition. The character witnesses David called on my behalf were limited and less impactful than Morrison's parade of prominent community members. Mrs. Delgado testified about seeing me care for Abuelo during his final years, bringing him groceries and spending time listening to his stories. But Morrison easily discredited her testimony by pointing out her advanced age and suggesting that her loyalty to me might cloud her judgment. Dr. Walsh testified about my professional competence at the veterinary clinic, but Morrison got her to admit that she had fired me due to concerns about the legal case and its impact on her business. As the trial progressed over 3 days, I watched the jury's expressions grow increasingly skeptical of my claims. Morrison had successfully planted seeds of doubt about my credibility, my motives, and my mental stability. The contrast between my family's polished presentation and my obvious financial struggles created a visual narrative that supported their version of events. On the morning of the 4th day, Judge Thompson was prepared to hear closing arguments. Morrison delivered a masterful summation that painted me as a tragic figure whose military service had damaged her beyond repair, leading her to exploit the one family member who still showed her kindness. Alejandro Martinez built his legacy through decades of honest work and family commitment, Morrison concluded. That legacy belongs to the family members who shared his values and contributed to his success, not to someone who manipulated his final years for personal gain. David's closing argument felt weak by comparison, hampered by limited resources and an overwhelming disadvantage in terms of witness credibility and courtroom presence. He emphasized the authenticity of Abuelo's letters and the legal validity of the will, but his arguments lacked the emotional impact of Morrison's presentation. Judge Thompson called a brief recess before rendering her decision, and I sat in the hallway outside the courtroom feeling completely defeated. The trial had been a public humiliation that exposed every private struggle I had faced since returning from military service. Even if I somehow won the case, my relationship with my family was destroyed beyond repair, and my reputation in Phoenix was permanently damaged. David sat beside me on the hard wooden bench, reviewing his notes one final time. "I'm sorry, Rebecca," he said quietly. "I did the best I could with what we had, but Morrison's team was just too well prepared." I nodded, too emotionally drained to respond. The inheritance had never really been about the money or the property. It had been about Abuelo's validation of my choices and his recognition of my value as a person. Losing the case meant losing that validation and accepting my family's judgment that I was indeed a failure who had contributed nothing of worth. When the bailiff called us back into the courtroom, I walked through those doors, expecting to hear Judge Thompson rule in favor of my family. I had prepared myself for defeat, for the final confirmation that I was everything they claimed I was. But as I took my seat at the defendant's table, I heard something unexpected. The sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway outside the courtroom, moving in perfect synchronization like a military formation. The courtroom doors swung open with authority, and 12 Marines in dress blue uniforms marched in behind me. The silence in the courtroom was absolute, as 12 Marines in immaculate dress blue uniforms filed through the doors with military precision. Their polished brass buttons caught the fluorescent lighting, and their white caps sat at perfect angles above stern, weathered faces that had seen combat in distant lands. The rhythmic click of their dress shoes against the marble floor echoed like a drumbeat, commanding attention from every person in the packed courtroom. Judge Thompson looked up from her papers with obvious surprise, her gavel frozen halfway to the bench. The bailiff stepped forward uncertainly, unsure whether to challenge this unexpected military presence or allow them to proceed. Morrison's confident demeanor faltered for the first time during the entire trial, his silver eyebrows furrowing as he tried to understand what was happening. Leading the formation was Gunnery Sergeant Michael Torres, a man whose chest displayed an impressive array of ribbons, including the Purple Heart, Bronze Star, and Combat Action Ribbon. Behind him marched 11 other Marines, each one bearing the distinctive bearing and intensity that marked them as combat veterans. Their ages ranged from late 20s to early 40s, representing different eras of military service, but they moved as one unit with the synchronization that only comes from shared hardship and mutual respect. As they reached the center aisle, Gunny Torres called a halt with a subtle hand gesture that brought all 12 Marines to a simultaneous stop. They executed a perfect facing movement toward the judge's bench, their movements so precise they could have been choreographed, though this display came from years of military discipline rather than rehearsal. "Your Honor," Gunny Torres announced in a voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard over artillery fire. "I am Gunnery Sergeant Michael Torres, United States Marine Corps. These Marines and I respectfully request permission to provide testimony relevant to this case." Judge Thompson recovered her composure quickly, though confusion was evident in her voice. "Gunnery Sergeant, this court was not expecting additional witnesses. The testimony phase of this trial has already concluded." Morrison jumped to his feet, his expensive suit suddenly looking less impressive compared to the military uniforms dominating the courtroom. "Objection, Your Honor. The prosecution had no notice of these witnesses. This is highly irregular and potentially prejudicial." David looked as stunned as everyone else, clearly having no advance knowledge of this development. He struggled to stand, papers scattering from his lap as he tried to process what was happening. "Your Honor, I had no prior contact with these witnesses, but if they have relevant testimony—" "With respect, Your Honor," Gunny Torres interrupted, his tone remaining formal but carrying an edge of steel. "We are not here as planned witnesses for either side. We are here because we became aware that a fellow Marine's character and service record were being systematically attacked in these proceedings. We have information that directly contradicts testimony that has been presented to this court." The murmur that rippled through the courtroom was unlike anything I had heard during the previous days of testimony. Spectators leaned forward in their seats, sensing that something unprecedented was about to unfold. My family's section had gone completely silent, their confident expressions replaced by obvious anxiety about this unexpected development. Judge Thompson studied the Marines for a long moment, clearly weighing legal precedent against the unique circumstances before her. "This is highly unusual, Gunnery Sergeant. What specific testimony do you wish to provide?" "Ma'am, we served alongside Lance Corporal Rebecca Martinez during Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. We have direct knowledge of her character, her service record, and the circumstances surrounding incidents that have been misrepresented in this courtroom." At the mention of my rank and deployment, several of the Marines turned slightly toward where I sat, their expressions conveying a mixture of respect and protective loyalty that I hadn't experienced since leaving active duty. For the first time in months, I felt like someone was fighting for me rather than against me. Morrison objected vigorously, citing procedural rules and arguing that character witnesses should have been disclosed during the discovery phase. But Judge Thompson seemed intrigued by the unprecedented situation and the obvious credibility of the military witnesses standing before her. "I'm going to allow limited testimony from these witnesses," she ruled, causing Morrison's face to flush with frustrated anger. "However, I will strictly control the scope of their statements to ensure relevance to the issues before this court." Gunny Torres stepped forward to be sworn in, his bearing so commanding that even the court reporter sat up straighter in her chair. As he placed his right hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, I noticed that his left hand bore scars from shrapnel wounds that had never quite healed properly. "Gunnery Sergeant Torres," David began, his voice gaining confidence as he realized this unexpected opportunity might salvage our case. "How do you know the defendant, Rebecca Martinez?" I served as Lance Corporal Martinez's squad leader during her deployment to Forward Operating Base Chapman in Afghanistan from March 2018 to November 2018. She was assigned to my unit for convoy security operations in Kandahar Province. "Can you describe her performance during that deployment?" Torres straightened even further, if such a thing were possible. Lance Corporal Martinez was one of the finest Marines I had the privilege to serve alongside in 22 years of military service. She volunteered for the most dangerous assignments, maintained exemplary discipline under fire, and repeatedly demonstrated courage that saved the lives of her fellow Marines. Morrison rose to object, but Judge Thompson gestured for him to remain seated, clearly interested in hearing the testimony. "Can you provide specific examples of her performance?" David continued. "On July 15, 2018, our convoy came under attack from an improvised explosive device approximately 15 kilometers outside Kandahar City. The blast disabled our lead vehicle and wounded 2 Marines, including Lance Corporal Sarah Chen and Corporal Marcus Williams, who were trapped in the burning vehicle. I closed my eyes, remembering that day with crystal clarity. The acrid smell of burning fuel, the screams of wounded Marines, the sound of incoming small arms fire from Taliban fighters, who had positioned themselves to capitalize on the chaos following the explosion. Lance Corporal Martinez was riding in the second vehicle," Torres continued. "Despite being under direct enemy fire, she exited her armored vehicle and ran approximately 50 meters across open ground to reach the disabled vehicle. She pulled both wounded Marines to safety while under continuous fire from enemy positions." The courtroom was completely silent now, the previous murmur of conversation replaced by absolute attention to Torres's testimony. Even Morrison had stopped shuffling through his papers, apparently recognizing that objecting to heroism under fire would not play well with the jury. After securing the wounded Marines, Lance Corporal Martinez provided suppressing fire that allowed our medic to reach the casualties and begin treatment. Her actions directly contributed to saving the lives of Lance Corporal Chen and Corporal Williams. David paused to let the impact of this testimony sink in before continuing. "Were you present during the incident that resulted in the deaths of Chen and Williams?" Torres's expression darkened, and several of the other Marines visibly tensed. "Yes, sir. That occurred during our second IED attack on September 3, 2018. Lance Corporal Martinez was driving the lead vehicle when we hit a complex ambush involving multiple explosive devices and coordinated small arms fire." "Can you describe what happened?" "The initial explosion destroyed the engine compartment of Martinez's vehicle and wounded her driver, Private First Class James Patterson. Despite suffering a concussion from the blast, Martinez maintained control of the vehicle and began coordinating our response to the ambush." Torres paused, his jaw working as he recalled the traumatic events. The second explosion occurred when Lance Corporal Chen and Corporal Williams attempted to reach our position from their disabled vehicle. They were caught in the open when a secondary device detonated. What was Lance Corporal Martinez's response to the loss of her fellow Marines? She attempted to reach their position despite direct orders to maintain cover. It took 3 Marines to physically restrain her from running into the kill zone where Chen and Williams had fallen. She blamed herself for their deaths, even though the ambush was a coordinated attack that could not have been prevented by any action on her part. I felt tears streaming down my face as Torres recounted the worst day of my military career. The guilt I had carried for years was suddenly being addressed by someone who had actually been there, someone who understood the impossible choices we had faced in that moment. Morrison finally found his voice for cross-examination, but his usual confidence was notably absent. "Gunnery Sergeant, isn't it true that military personnel often exaggerate the heroism of their fellow service members?" Torres's response was immediate and cutting. "Sir, I have written 17 letters to families of Marines killed in action during my career. I do not exaggerate when it comes to the sacrifice and courage of the Marines under my command." The rebuke was so sharp and delivered with such authority that Morrison actually stepped backward. Several jurors were openly glaring at him for his disrespectful question. David called the next witness, Staff Sergeant Jennifer Walsh, a Marine military police officer who had served as my convoy commander during the latter part of my deployment. Her testimony focused on my leadership qualities and my dedication to the welfare of junior Marines under my supervision. Lance Corporal Martinez was promoted to team leader after only 4 months in the country, Staff Sergeant Walsh testified. That's an extremely rare occurrence that reflects exceptional performance and the trust of her commanding officers. But the most powerful testimony came from Private First Class Daniel Kim, a young Marine who had been wounded during my final month of deployment. Kim, now 25 and working as an engineer in Denver, had flown to Phoenix at his own expense to testify on my behalf. Lance Corporal Martinez saved my life, Kim stated simply, not just on the battlefield, but afterward, when I was struggling with survivor's guilt and considering suicide. She spent hours talking me through the darkest period of my life, even though she was dealing with her own trauma from losing Chenin Williams. Kim's voice broke slightly as he continued. She taught me that surviving doesn't make you guilty of anything, except having more time to honor the memory of those who didn't make it home. Without her guidance, I wouldn't be here today. The emotional impact of Kim's testimony was visible throughout the courtroom. Several jurors were crying openly, and even Judge Thompson appeared moved by his words. In the gallery, my family sat in stunned silence, finally hearing the truth about my military service from people who had actually witnessed it. One by one, the Marines provided testimony that completely dismantled Morrison's portrayal of me as an unstable manipulator. They described acts of courage, selflessness, and leadership that painted a picture of someone who had consistently put others before herself, even at great personal cost. Sergeant Major Robert Hayes, the senior enlisted Marine in the group, provided the most comprehensive overview of my character. In 30 years of military service, I have rarely encountered a Marine who combined tactical competence with such genuine concern for the welfare of others, he testified. The suggestion that Lance Corporal Martinez would manipulate or exploit a vulnerable person is completely contrary to everything I observed during our deployment together. Morrison's cross-examinations grew increasingly desperate as he realized that his carefully constructed narrative was crumbling under the weight of first-hand testimony from credible military witnesses. His attempts to suggest that combat bonding might cloud their judgment fell flat, particularly when several Marines provided specific dates, times, and documentation to support their accounts. The final Marine to testify was Corporal Anthony Rodriguez, who had maintained contact with me throughout my transition to civilian life. His testimony addressed the challenges I had faced since leaving the military and the family's treatment of my struggles. Martinez reached out to me about 6 months ago, Rodriguez testified. She was having a rough time adjusting to civilian life, and she mentioned that her family didn't understand what she had been through overseas. She never asked for anything except someone to talk to who had shared similar experiences. Did she ever mention her grandfather's will or any inheritance disputes? David asked. Never, Rodriguez replied firmly. Our conversations focused on dealing with nightmares, finding employment, and adjusting to life outside the military. She was more concerned about being a burden on her family than about getting anything from them. When the Marine testimony concluded, the atmosphere in the courtroom had completely shifted. The respectful silence that had characterized their presence gave way to animated whispers, as spectators processed what they had just heard. My family's section looked shell-shocked, their confident expressions replaced by obvious discomfort and dawning realization that their case was falling apart. Judge Thompson called for a brief recess, during which Gunny Torres approached me at the defendant's table. Martinez, he said quietly, using my military surname in the way that immediately transported me back to our shared deployment. We've got your 6, Marine, always. The simple phrase, military slang for watching someone's back, broke through the emotional walls I had built during months of legal warfare. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I wasn't fighting alone. Mayuri. When court reconvened after the recess, Judge Thompson's demeanor had noticeably shifted. The stern, skeptical expression she had maintained throughout Morrison's presentation had been replaced by something approaching respect as she looked toward where I sat surrounded by the Marines who had traveled from across the country to defend my honor. Morrison attempted one final gambit during his rebuttal, arguing that the Marine testimony, while admirable, was irrelevant to the question of whether I had manipulated my grandfather into changing his will. But his words lacked conviction, and his usual commanding presence had been diminished by the devastating credibility gap between his character assassination and the first-hand accounts of military heroism. "Your Honor," Morrison said, his voice lacking its earlier authority, "while we all respect the service of these Marines, their testimony doesn't address the central issue of this case. The question before this court is whether Rebecca Martinez exploited her grandfather's emotional vulnerability for financial gain, not whether she performed admirably during military deployment." David rose for his final argument, and for the first time during the entire proceedings he spoke with genuine passion rather than defensive uncertainty. "Your Honor, character is exactly what this case is about. The plaintiff's entire argument rests on the assertion that my client is someone capable of manipulating and exploiting an elderly family member. The testimony we've heard today proves conclusively that Rebecca Martinez is exactly the opposite, someone who has repeatedly sacrificed her own welfare for others." He gestured toward the Marines, who remained standing at attention despite the informal courtroom setting. "These witnesses didn't come here because they were subpoenaed or paid. They came because they couldn't stand by while someone who had saved their lives was being portrayed as a manipulator and a fraud." Judge Thompson nodded slowly, her gaze moving between the two legal teams before settling on me. "Before I render my decision, I want to address something that has become clear during these proceedings. This court has heard extensive testimony about mental health challenges, family dysfunction, and allegations of manipulation. But we have also heard compelling evidence about service, sacrifice, and character." She paused, consulting her notes before continuing. "The law requires that I determine whether Alejandro Martinez was of sound mind when he executed his will, and whether that will represents his genuine intentions rather than the product of undue influence." The courtroom was completely silent as Judge Thompson began her ruling. "Based on the evidence presented, including the authenticated letters written by Mr. Martinez and the testimony regarding his mental state, I find that he was fully competent when he made his final testamentary decisions." Morrison's shoulders sagged slightly, but Judge Thompson wasn't finished. "Furthermore, the character evidence presented by the Marine witnesses provides crucial context for understanding Mr. Martinez's motivations. Rather than being manipulated by an unstable granddaughter, the evidence suggests that he made a deliberate choice to reward someone whose values aligned with his own immigrant work ethic and commitment to service above self." My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear the judge's words over the rush of blood in my ears. "The court finds that the plaintiff has failed to prove undue influence by clear and convincing evidence. The will of Alejandro Martinez, dated September 15, 2021, is hereby validated and will be executed according to its terms." The gavel came down with finality, but the sound was almost lost in the eruption that followed. Mrs. Delgado let out a cry of joy from the back of the courtroom, while my family's section sat in stunned silence. Elena's perfectly composed facade finally cracked, her face contorting with rage and disbelief. Morrison immediately announced his intention to appeal, but the damage to his reputation was already done. Several jurors were openly applauding the Marines, and court officers made no attempt to restore order as spectators began filing out of the courtroom with animated conversations about the dramatic reversal they had just witnessed. Gunny Torres approached me as I sat in shock, still processing what had just happened. "Martinez, you good?" he asked, using the gentle tone he had employed when talking me through panic attacks during our deployment. I nodded, unable to speak as emotions I had suppressed for months finally broke through. The 12 Marines formed a protective circle around me, as photographers and reporters tried to capture images of the victorious defendant, their presence providing both physical and psychological shelter from the media chaos. My family filed out of the courtroom without attempting to speak to me, their expensive legal team trailing behind them like mourners at a funeral. Elena shot me a look of pure hatred as she passed, while Carlos and Diego avoided eye contact entirely. My father paused for a moment, his face showing a complex mixture of emotions that might have included regret, but he ultimately followed his other children toward the exit without saying a word. The aftermath of the trial unfolded over the following weeks, with consequences that extended far beyond the legal victory. Morrison, Webb and Partners faced intense scrutiny from the Arizona Bar Association after details of their tactics became public. The Phoenix Business Journal, which had initially portrayed me as a gold-digging manipulator, published a front-page apology and a detailed account of my military service record. More importantly, the trial had exposed the toxic dynamics within my family that extended far beyond sibling rivalry. Carlos resigned from Martinez Construction Company amid questions about his financial management, while Diego faced his own legal challenges when several former employees came forward with allegations of workplace discrimination against veterans. Elena's husband, Councilman Richard Pemberton, saw his political career effectively ended when recordings surfaced of him making derogatory comments about broken soldiers at a private fundraising event. The recordings, apparently leaked by a disgusted donor who had attended the trial, went viral on social media and led to calls for his resignation. But the most satisfying consequence came when I discovered the full extent of Abuelo's estate planning. The will that had been contested was only part of a larger financial strategy he had implemented during his final years. Investigation by forensic accountants revealed that he had been systematically transferring assets out of the family business and into private accounts, apparently suspicious of his son's management decisions. When the complete estate was finally settled, I inherited not just the house and cars mentioned in the disputed will, but also a network of real estate investments and business holdings worth over $8 million. Abuelo had been far wealthier than anyone in the family realized, and he had carefully structured his assets to ensure that his values-based legacy would survive his death. The house on Desert Rose Lane became my sanctuary in ways that Abuelo could never have anticipated. I spent months restoring it to reflect both his memory and my own vision for the future. The garage where he had maintained his collection of vintage automobiles became a workshop where I began rebuilding classic cars, a hobby that provided therapeutic focus for my PTSD symptoms while honoring his mechanical expertise. 6 months after the trial, I used part of my inheritance to establish the Alejandro Martinez Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping veterans transition to civilian careers. The foundation provided job training, mental health support, and financial assistance to former military personnel struggling with the same challenges I had faced. Gunny Torres became the foundation's first director of veteran services, bringing his decades of military leadership experience to the civilian mission of helping former Marines find their place in the world. Staff Sergeant Walsh developed our job placement program, leveraging her connections throughout the Southwest to create employment opportunities specifically designed for veterans. The Foundation's first major initiative was purchasing an abandoned warehouse in downtown Phoenix and converting it into a comprehensive veterans center. The facility included job training workshops, mental health counseling services, and transitional housing for homeless veterans. We partnered with local automotive dealerships to create a mechanics training program that prepared veterans for certification in civilian repair shops. Within 18 months, the Foundation had helped over 300 veterans find stable employment and housing. The success stories included former Marines who had struggled with addiction, homelessness, and unemployment, now working as mechanics, electricians, security specialists, and small business owners throughout Arizona. Private First Class Daniel Kim, whose testimony about my intervention during his suicidal crisis had been so powerful during the trial, became one of the Foundation's most effective counselors. His engineering background and personal experience with combat trauma made him uniquely qualified to help other veterans navigate the technical and emotional challenges of civilian transition. The Foundation also attracted attention from corporate sponsors who wanted to demonstrate their support for veterans' causes. Major employers, including Intel, Honeywell, and Southwest Airlines, established partnerships that guaranteed job interviews for Foundation graduates who met basic qualifications. My relationship with my immediate family never recovered from the trial. Carlos, Diego, and Elena maintained their position that I had manipulated Abuelo, despite the overwhelming evidence to the contrary. They continued to live in Phoenix, but we moved in completely different social circles and rarely encountered each other, except at unavoidable community events. My father made several attempts to reconcile during the first year after the trial, apparently motivated by guilt about his testimony and the realization that he had lost his only daughter to family greed. But the damage was too extensive to repair with awkward phone calls and stilted lunch meetings. The man who had once been disappointed by my decision to serve my country had ultimately testified against my character in open court. The extended family and family friends who had supported my siblings during the trial found themselves facing social consequences, as details of the case became widely known throughout Phoenix's business community. Several of the character witnesses who had testified against me faced criticism from their own social circles, while others privately reached out to express regret about their participation in what was increasingly viewed as a vindictive family attack. Mrs. Patricia Henley, the neighbor who had provided false testimony about my behavior at Abuelo's house, eventually approached me at a grocery store to apologize. She claimed that my brothers had pressured her to exaggerate her account and had promised to help her with some property tax issues in exchange for her cooperation. The most unexpected reconciliation came from Dr. Susan Walsh at the veterinary clinic. She visited me at the foundation 6 months after the trial and offered to hire me back at a significantly higher salary. When I explained that my new responsibilities with the foundation made returning to clinical work impossible, she instead became one of our major donors and began referring veteran job applicants to our training programs. 2 years after the trial, I received an invitation that surprised me more than any other development in this long saga. The Phoenix Chamber of Commerce, the same organization that had supported my family during the legal proceedings, asked me to speak at their annual awards dinner about veteran entrepreneurship and community service. The irony was perfect. I was being honored by the same business community that had once viewed me as an unstable gold digger who had manipulated her grandfather's final wishes. The Chamber's president, a real estate developer who had attended every day of the trial in support of my family, introduced me as an inspiring example of how military service translates into civilian leadership. My acceptance speech focused on Abuelo's values and the importance of supporting veterans who were struggling to find their place in civilian society. I spoke about the responsibility that comes with inherited wealth and the obligation to use financial resources for purposes that honor the memory of those who made prosperity possible. My grandfather came to this country with nothing except determination and faith in the American dream, I told the audience of business leaders. He built his success through honest work and community investment. The inheritance he left me wasn't just money and property. It was a responsibility to continue his commitment to helping others achieve their own version of that dream. The standing ovation that followed felt like final vindication, not just of my character but of Abuelo's judgment about who would best preserve his legacy. 3 years after that day, when 12 Marines marched into a Phoenix courtroom to defend my honor, I stood in the garage where Abuelo had once worked on his vintage cars, now serving as headquarters for a foundation that had helped over 1,000 veterans transition to successful civilian careers. On the wall hung a framed photograph from my Marine graduation ceremony, the one Abuelo had driven 15 hours to attend when the rest of my family found excuses to stay home. Next to it was the final letter he had written to me, the one he was clutching when he died, expressing his pride in the woman I had become. The inheritance dispute had been about more than money or property. It had been about whether someone who chose service over profit, courage over comfort, and integrity over family loyalty deserved to be recognized and rewarded for those choices. Abuelo had made his decision, the courts had validated it, and hundreds of veterans had benefited from his wisdom about character and values. Sometimes justice doesn't just prevail. It creates a legacy that extends far beyond the original dispute, touching lives and changing communities in ways that money alone could never accomplish. That's the real inheritance he left me, not the financial resources to build a comfortable life, but the responsibility to honor his memory by helping others find their own path to dignity and success. The 12 Marines who had marched in behind me that day hadn't just defended my reputation. They had defended the principle that service and sacrifice matter, that character counts, and that families should support rather than destroy the people who choose difficult paths for noble reasons. In the end, that principle proved stronger than greed, more enduring than family dysfunction, and more powerful than the best legal representation that money could buy. 5 years after the trial, I received a phone call that brought the story full circle in a way I never could have anticipated. The caller identified herself as Maria Santos, a social worker with the Phoenix Department of Veterans Affairs. She was calling about my father. Roberto Martinez, now 73 years old, had suffered a severe stroke that left him partially paralyzed and unable to manage his daily affairs. My siblings, apparently overwhelmed by the demands of caregiving, and the mounting medical expenses had essentially abandoned him to the state care system. "Your father keeps asking for Rebecca," Maria explained during our phone conversation. "He says he needs to talk to his daughter about something important. The nursing facility staff thought you should know." I hadn't spoken to my father in over 3 years, not since his final awkward attempt at reconciliation had ended in mutual frustration and unresolved anger. The temptation to ignore Maria's call was overwhelming. After everything he had done during the trial, he had forfeited any claim to my concern or assistance. But as I stood in Abuelo's workshop, surrounded by tools he had used to build his American dream, I heard his voice echoing through my memory. "La familia is complicated, Mika. Sometimes forgiveness is not about excusing what people have done, but about choosing who you want to be." I visited my father at the Sunrise Manor Care Facility the following week, finding him in a wheelchair by a window overlooking a small courtyard garden. The proud, authoritative man who had once commanded construction crews and intimidated business competitors had been reduced to a frail figure whose hands shook when he tried to drink from a water cup. "Rebecca," he whispered when he saw me approaching, his voice thick with the speech difficulties that followed his stroke. "You came." We talked for 2 hours that first visit, though talked might be too generous a description of the halting, emotional conversation that followed. My father struggled to form words, but his message was unmistakably clear. He was consumed with regret about his testimony during the trial and the role he had played in trying to destroy my inheritance. "I was angry," he managed to say, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "You chose a different path. I thought you rejected everything I built." Over the following months, I visited him regularly, gradually piecing together his perspective on the family dynamics that had led to our estrangement. He revealed that my brothers had pressured him to contest the will, arguing that my inheritance threatened the family business and their own financial security. More importantly, he admitted that he had never understood my decision to join the Marines, because he feared it meant I didn't value the opportunities he had worked so hard to provide. His testimony during the trial had been motivated by hurt pride rather than genuine belief that I had manipulated Abuelo. "Your grandfather was right about you," he said during one particularly difficult conversation. "You have strength I never recognized." These conversations led to an unexpected collaboration. My father had extensive knowledge about construction and property development that proved invaluable as the Veterans Foundation expanded its programs. From his wheelchair in the nursing facility, he began serving as an informal consultant for our housing initiatives, providing advice about building codes, contractor selection, and project management. His involvement with the foundation became a source of purpose that improved his health and outlook dramatically. The nursing staff noted that he was more engaged and motivated when discussing foundation projects than during any other activities. When my father passed away peacefully in his sleep 18 months later, I was holding his hand. His final words were a barely audible apology and a request that I continue honoring Abuelo's legacy through the foundation's work. The funeral was small and private, attended only by the nursing facility staff who had cared for him, a few foundation volunteers who had come to know him through our projects, and myself. My siblings did not attend, apparently still bitter about his reconciliation with me and his support for the foundation that they viewed as built on stolen family assets. But in his final years, my father had found a way to contribute to something meaningful, something that honored both Abuelo's values and the military service he had once failed to understand. Sometimes redemption comes late, but it still counts when it comes with genuine remorse and a commitment to making amends. Today, the Alejandro Martinez Foundation operates 3 facilities across Arizona and has helped over 2,000 veterans successfully transition to civilian careers. A small plaque near the entrance of our main facility bears my father's name alongside Abuelo's, acknowledging his contributions during those final 18 months when he chose reconciliation over resentment. The 12 Marines who changed everything that day in court remain involved with the foundation in various capacities, their bond with me strengthened by the knowledge that their courage to speak truth had created something lasting and meaningful for countless other veterans who needed someone to believe in their worth. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.